Hi guys, so Michael Gove was interviewed on Sky News about the new lockdown that Boris Johnson imposed and when it may end. So let's hear what he had to say.
It's 2 weeks ago since you were last in the studio, sitting in that very chair. I asked you if there was going to be another national lockdown, and I just want to play viewers your response to that question. 2 to 3 weeks circuit breaker to give us some breathing space to get on top of test and trace. People want to know, is that going to happen?
No.
It was a one-word answer, no. Why should people trust what you're going to tell them today?
Well, during the
They should not trust you because you'll tell them one thing one day and something else the other day. And I said at the time, you shouldn't be saying no. You should be saying we're leaving our options open. We would prefer not to do a lockdown, but we'll consider it if we can't get the numbers down.
course of the whole of that interview, I outlined that we would be willing to take whatever steps were necessary. But it wasn't necessary at that point. At that point, the advice that we were receiving was that a regional approach could succeed.
No, that is absolute crap. And he knows he's talking crap here because Sage told him, and he was actually saying it directly after Boris Johnson was speaking, the chief medical officer, that a regional lockdown is not sufficient. Tier 3 is not sufficient on its own to bring down the numbers. Like, what's the alternative to a Tier 3 lockdown? If Tier 3 was the highest level, and the chief medical officer was saying that Tier 3 is not sufficient on its own, then what is he talking about? Of course, he's talking about a lockdown. And of course, when Keir Starmer brought this up in Parliament, Boris Johnson ridiculed the idea.
In reducing the spread of infection from those areas where the infection rate was high to those areas where the infection rate was still, relatively speaking, lower. But unfortunately, over the course of the last 2 weeks, the virus has been spreading faster than predicted, and in a way that requires, as you quite rightly pointed out, what the Prime Minister has described as the nuclear option. And we've taken these steps because we believe that it's absolutely vitally necessary to safeguard the NHS at a time when the infection rate is doubling, when the number of people going to hospital is increasing significantly.
You have to remember, not that long ago, wasn't it Michael Gove, it was someone else, I think it was Matt Hancock, saying that, look, the numbers are increasing in parts of the country, but in other parts of the country, it's not increasing. It's under control, or there are no new cases. That's why we're not going to impose a lockdown. Now, that was a ridiculous idea, and I criticized it because I said people who are in one area can freely move to another area. They can spread the virus. It was a criticism. The Conservative Party were criticizing the government in Wales for wanting to restrict people crossing the border, saying that it was damaging the union because Wales had a lockdown and England did not have a lockdown.
And when the strain on our health service is such that we do need to take action.
It's a question of trust, though, isn't it? Because, as you say, later on in the interview, you expand on the answer. But when I asked you directly, a simple question, is there going to be a second national lockdown? You chose to give a one-word answer. No, there was...
No, and why did he do that? Because he knew the government's backbenchers would be watching this, would be listening to this. People who support the Conservative Party would be listening to this. They didn't want a lockdown. And Michael Gove hoped, okay, I'll say no, and then knowing that he'll have to do it later on, hoping that people would forget.
There's no nuance on that.
Well, you were asking, of course, about the context at that time. Was there going to be a circuit breaker?
No, it wasn't about... That was not... See the way how slimy he is? She said, will there be a lockdown? She didn't say, is there a lockdown today? She said, are you going to impose a lockdown? Is it something that you have on the cards? Is it a possibility? At the beginning, he said no. And then later on in the interview, he tried to qualify the answer with, well, we're leaving all our cards on the table. Of course, he wouldn't say, yes, we'll also impose a lockdown. Saying, we have a lot of things we can choose from. But he wouldn't mention a lockdown. This is the dishonesty of this government.
of the kind that was
It's
being
2 weeks
proposed
ago. It's not that long
at
ago,
that
is it?
time. Well, one of the things about the virus is that over the course of the last 2 weeks, we've seen not just in the United Kingdom, but also in France, Germany, Italy, and other comparable countries, the spread of the virus being greater than any of us had anticipated.
But 2 weeks ago, we did know, though, didn't we, that cases were rising. SAGE were already recommending a national lockdown. We knew that deaths may go up as well.
Well, we also know that at that time, the advice that we were receiving, including from the Chief Medical Officer and the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, was that a regional approach could work.
No. They were not saying that. They were saying the absolute opposite. They were saying Tier 3 would not work on its own. Like, what is the alternative to Tier 3 working on its own? Like Tier 3 plus? Tier 3 with something else added on? Of course they were talking about a lockdown, but they were being told, of course, by the government, don't use the L word. We have to avoid the L word. Why? Well, because probably Keir Starmer mentioned it and got away with it. He mentioned it, and we can't be seen as following the leader of the opposition. Now, maybe I'm being overly cynical here, but that's why I'm reading from this. Keir Starmer mentioned a circuit breaker, a lockdown. The Welsh government imposed a lockdown, a circuit breaker. The Conservative Party didn't want to be seen as following the Labour Party, didn't want to be seen as following the Welsh government, so they resisted. Now, how many people are going to die because of that resistance? Political resistance, not following the science. Now, this interview goes on for a bit longer, but I want to jump to this part here. Let me just bear with me, where Michael Gove was asked about an exit strategy. How can people get out of this lockdown?
I'm keen to talk about an exit strategy.
Yes.
Because we all know once you're in lockdown, it's very difficult to get out of lockdown. So whatever happens, will this national lockdown end on the 2nd of December, or will it be driven by what the data shows?
Well, we're going to review it on the 2nd of December, but we're always driven by what the data shows.
Once again, lies. The data was showing that you should have gone into a lockdown. You didn't. The data at the end of the first wave was you shouldn't ease the lockdown yet because the data shows that numbers are too high. But you went against that and you eased the lockdown. Once again, it's lies, lies, lies.
Now, on the basis of...
so it could be extended? On
the basis of what we've been told, we believe that all of the measures that we're putting in place will reduce the R rate below 1. As you and our viewers know, that's the point at which you actually see...
So this is all just useless language. He's trying to avoid any sort of clarity. Why is he doing that? Because he knows that if he says, well, when we get the R number down to like below 1, or if we can get the number of new cases down below 100 a day or something like that, people will ask for the lockdown to be finished, to be ended. But the problem is that if the government can't get to a certain standard, people will say, well, you're not succeeding. If the government set a standard and fail, then they know that they will be blamed for it. So what do? They don't set a standard. They decide when we'll ease the lockdown, not the figures themselves. They'll pretend that the figures are important, but they will not follow the figures. They will decide themselves when to ease the lockdown.
A decline in the spread of the virus rather than its maintenance or increase.
So that is the key data you'll be looking at. And if the R hasn't been brought under 1 by the 2nd of December, could the lockdown be extended?
We're going to look at all of the data. We've got this 4-week period during which we're going to review progress. But of course, we'll always be driven by the data. Now, it's our hope on the basis of the analysis that we have that we will have significantly reduced the reinfection rate. And again, one of the things that I know is very difficult, because none of these measures are easy, is that people will understandably say, well, this particular restriction, this individual restriction, is something that I find particularly difficult. Can we take it away? The difficulty is that if we chop away at all of the restrictions, we may end up in a position where we don't have a sufficiently strong team or bundle or raft of restrictions necessary in order to get R below 1.
So to be crystal clear then, what you seem to be saying is if you're hoping, of course, the data will show that
Yes.
infections are going down, that the R is going down. But if the data on the whole is not looking as you were hoping, then the national lockdown could be extended.
We will always take a decision in the national interest based on evidence. The best information we have...
Is that yes?
Yes.
It's...
Okay, it's a yes. Finally, we got a yes. Now, my fear is that the government have not done a good job of dealing with the pandemic, the first wave of the pandemic. They acted too slowly. They imposed the lockdown very late. They eased the lockdown too early. The numbers were not sufficiently down. They were driven not by the data. They were not driven by the objective of let's get the numbers down so we can implement a functional test and trace. They were getting the numbers down so they can get the economy working again. Now, there's the hope that with this lockdown, the numbers will be sufficiently suppressed that test, trace and isolate, if isolate is part of the plan, but at least test and trace will work. Now, if it doesn't work, you know what's going to happen? The numbers will start to spread. The numbers will start to go up again, and you're going to have another lockdown in a few months' time. This is very, very important. The numbers have to be significantly suppressed in order for test, trace, and isolate, if added, is working. Because it's not going to work unless it meets that criteria. The government are not saying what that criteria is, what numbers they see as acceptable per day of new cases or new deaths. That's their decision. I think it would make much more sense to be clear with the public and say, look, we need to get the new cases down to X. When we get down to X, then we can ease the lockdown. If the numbers start to rise above Y, then we need to impose a new lockdown. At least be clear with people, clear with the public, so they understand what the objective is. At the moment, they don't know what it is. The government are imposing something, and unfortunately, I think a lot of the trust that existed at the beginning of the first lockdown has been lost. And it's not just happening in the UK, it's happening in many countries around Europe. The idea of us imposing a second lockdown, we don't have the public on side like we did before. It's going to be much more difficult to impose it. It's going to be much more difficult for people to convince people to respect it. And it's going to make the fight much longer. It's going to see us not have the numbers of new cases sufficiently down to ease the lockdown in the correct way. And what's going to happen is we're going to ease lockdowns for political reasons, not for scientific ones. That's my fear. One final thing is, I think it's interesting that Michael Gove, who's responsible for Brexit preparations surrounding the transition period, is talking on Sky News about a lockdown. I don't know why that's the case. Maybe you do. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what do you think? As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons. You ensure that this channel continues to exist. I'm eternally grateful for all of your support. If you join Patreon, you will receive instant access to our Discord server, where we have both audio and video chats. You can chat with me and other patrons, where we discuss important and non-important issues. Becoming a patron per month costs about the same as a large coffee, so why not check it out?